It's okay. It's now a pleasure to introduce Dr. Joanne Morra. One of the omissions in our conversations so far in these seminars is the Personality Museum. So museums are dedicated to the life work of specific sort of individuals is something we haven't really interrogated so far within the seminar series, and Joanne has been working on a monographic publication on site responsive projects by artists in two personality museums, the Freud museums, both Vienna and London. And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the methodological curatorial dynamics of these two institutions, despite both being Freudian museums, differ quite significantly in their approaches to this. Yes. But it was important, I think, at this point to introduce this question of the personality museum overall, because there are multiple sort of curatorial dynamics occurring within personality museums, including, for example, the work that Hans-Ulrich Obrist has been doing in the homes of writers, other artists, etc., in many sort of places in the world, including his sort of work within the home of Lorca, etc. But I'm delighted that in advance of her publication, Jo has agreed to be able to address us today, and so we're getting access to her thinking around this before her publication actually becomes public.
Oh, you did it. Oh, great. Okay. All right.
He does everything.
I know. I want to take him home.
No. If he wants to go. Later.
Okay. Okay. My talk is First, thank you for the invitation, Jason. And thank you to Denise and Shell for organizing everything so splendidly, and Shell for being on call for most of my trying to get to London, trying to get here from London yesterday, so he was very helpful for various reasons beyond my control, and also for the hospitality. Thank you. Okay. My talk is in two parts. So the first 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to map out the project that I'm working on. I've been invited to talk about the book project, so I just want to lay some territory down. And then the last 20 minutes is I'm going to be presenting a case of an exhibition at the Freud Museum, London, and that's kind of a more formal, I'm going to be reading a paper, although it's quite open, so it's not a dense paper, but hopefully it will have the affect that I would like it to have. Okay, so the title of the talk is Autobiographical Fictions, Encounters with Sigmund Freud and Melanie Klein inside the Freud Museum, and that is the title for the case history, actually. But before that, I want to tell you a little bit about the Freud museums. So, Freud moved into Bourgeois 19 in Vienna in 1891. He left in 1938 after the Nazis took over Austria, and he left with his immediate family. Bourgeois 19 is the building, and they occupied apartment 5 first, and the family moved into apartment 5. He had his practice in apartment 5, then he had his practice in apartment 4, and then when his sister moved out of apartment 6, he moved into apartment 6, and they're next to one another. So when you go to the Freud Museum now, you have access to apartment 5 and 6. Freud was there for almost 50 years. He saw almost all of his patients in Bourgeois. He wrote all of the major works of psychoanalysis in Bourgeois. Martha, his wife, raised, and Minna, sister-in-law, raised the family in Bourgeois. Freud had a very strong interest in archaeology and was a collector of antiquities. He collected over 2,000 antiquities. At a certain point in his career, he was buying one a week. So very, very interested in archaeology. as a practice, as a scientific practice in the 19th century. He was reading all the newspapers, he knew everything that was going on, and also as a metaphor for understanding psychoanalysis. So he was interested in understanding the formation of the human subject as archaeological through a series of stratifications, and he was also interested in archaeology as a practice, and he felt that psychoanalysis as a practice was like archaeology, that we excavate the mind, we excavate the unconscious in psychoanalytic practice to get to the treasures. Okay, so that's quite important to know about Bergassa. Very, very, very important for its career. That's the upshot of that. 20 Mansfield Gardens, London, 1938, the Freud family moved to London. They were able to take all of their belongings with them, by which I mean the couch, Freud's desk, Freud's chair, all of Freud's antiquities, which is quite extraordinary, and about a third of his book collection. He had to sell a lot of his book collection in order to pay for the taxes that the Nazis levied on the family in order to leave Bergassa. He was there for 1 year. He died in 1939. He died, his doctor administered a dose of morphine. He had a plan, he had a pact with his doctor that if the cancer of his mouth got so bad that the doctor, Dr. Schur, was going to end his life, and that's what happened. So after he died, Anna Freud was living there. She, as you may know, is a child psychoanalyst. She started her practice in Bergassa, but really developed her practice in Mansfield Gardens, and she died in 1982. So she spent a very, very long time living in Mansfield Garden with her female companion, Dorothy Burlingham, who was also a practicing child psychoanalyst. And the mythology of 20 Mansfield Garden is that when Freud died, his consulting room and study, which is on the ground floor in a double room, it stayed the way Freud had left it. It was closed off, and it remained that way until, well, forever. That's the myth, forever. Just before Anna Freud died, she got in touch with charitable foundations and set up the situation so that Mansfield Gardens would become a museum. And it opened as a museum in 1986. She died in 1984. 82, so it was 4 years later. Okay. So, big difference. Everything happened in Bergassa, but Bergassa is now empty. Bergassa is the site of trauma. The trauma of the Freud family leaving, and in effect, the trauma of the Holocaust. Okay. Freud lost 4 of his sisters to the Holocaust and their respective families. Mansfield Garden, he spent 1 year in Mansfield Gardens. All of the stuff, all of the objects are there. So phenomenologically, if we want to talk about the phenomenology of objects, they are to be found in London. Empty, full, but not quite so simple. Okay. The Personality Museum. The Personality Museum is a subcategory of what Fiona Candlin has called the micro-museum, which is a small, micro-museums being a small independent museum like the medical museum, where the students had their really good show. And a Personality Museum is a genre, a subcategory of that genre. It's a house that is dedicated to the life and work of an individual. Most often writers, big growth splurge of them in the 19th century, when it was a part of the pilgrimage of the middle classes to go and look at the house where various authors wrote. Also also politicians. So the first one in the United States was the George Washington Museum. Okay, so what do I think about? I'm going to just give you 2 sort of theoretical mappings of the Personality Museum. The Personality Museum is a museum dedicated to practice. right? The artist worked there. The author wrote there. Freud practiced there. He saw his patients there. So I'm quite interested in that fundamental aspect of the Personality Museum. On top of that, they function like other museums. So they're interested in preservation and display and curation, in narratives and the architecture, so all of those kinds of things. So I think that De Certeau is helpful in thinking about it when he talks about space as a practiced place. And he talks about architectural, material, historical, ideological vectors and velocities that constitute a space as a practiced place. And I think that an interesting and profitable valuable way of thinking about the Personality Museum is to think about all of these aspects. I'm particularly interested in their history and their ideology and the mythology that they want to create for themselves and the way that they produce that. And also De Certeau, he relied on Merleau-Ponty's work, and he was really interested in the way that space is always activated by a subject. So he gives the example of a park, and a park becomes a space and a practiced place when somebody walks through the park, particularly when someone walks through the park not in the pathways that are created for you, but cuts through the park. And so he uses Merleau-Ponty to introduce the subject, and I think that's also really important. I think the visitor to the Personality Museum is vital in activating the museum, as well as the subject who lived there. So the Personality Museum then is constituted by history and memory of the person who lived there, but also of what the visitor brings to the museum. There was also, I also use a little bit of, I use various bits of Adorno in this as well, particularly his ideas of the museum as a mausoleum, which I think is totally appropriate to the Personality Museum because, of course, often the person who lived in the museum died in the museum, but also the static element of Personality Museums makes them very much related to the mausoleum. And I also am very interested in Foucault and Foucault's idea of the dispositif. So there is kind of an ideological and political narrative in the project that I think is important. Freud on space. He didn't really write about space, like architectural space. He did write about the space of the mind and the space of the unconscious. But in 1938, while he was in London, he wrote a series of aphorisms and from 1938 to 1939, and they're collected in the last volume of his oeuvre, his entire works. And this is one of them. He says, space may be the projection of the extension of the psychical apparatus. No other derivation is probable. Psyche is extended, knows nothing about it. On the one hand, totally complicated and very difficult to unpack. On the other hand, I think Freud was really wanting to talk about the way in which the psychical apparatus of the individual who embodies a space is projected onto that space. So he enables me to think about the Personality Museum as psychically embodied. And I think that's very, very important. So history, memory, but also psyche. So it gives it psychoanalytic take, which I think is important. Okay, Freud Museum London, Freud Museum Vienna. Freud Museum London, they're polar opposites, the way that they construct themselves, the way they think about themselves as museums, and their histories. And I think that they're a good bookend to the Personality Museum. Mansfield Gardens. Mansfield Gardens is a typical hagiographic personality museum, by which I mean it really celebrates and sanctifies the life and work of the individual who lived there. It's called the Freud Museum, which is important because Vienna is the Sigmund Freud Museum. So it's called the Freud Museum, and its impetus, right, is to think of itself as a Sigmund Freud and a Freud museum. But actually, it's all about Sigmund Freud. It just is totally about Sigmund Freud. So that's kind of interesting. So there's already this kind of displacement of Anna Freud, which happens in multiple ways. It happened throughout her life, in various ways, which I could talk about. But in the museum itself, it's, you know, its pretense is that it's about both of them, but really it's all about Sigmund Freud. It's a hagiographic museum dedicated to the life and work of Sigmund Freud. And I'm going to give you just one contrasting example. So we know that this is the consulting room in Mansfield Gardens. That's his desk with all of his antiquities. That's a part of his library. And that's the bourgeois consulting room, the black and white image. The consulting room and study were set up to replicate bourgeois. Okay, they're quite different, but they did the best they could. But it always goes back to bourgeois. So Mansfield Gardens is undermined by this fact that it has everything in it, but it goes back to bourgeois. The other thing that I wanted to say is that we have been told that Freud's consulting room and study has not been changed since 1939. He died in September 1939. As opposed to the Anna Freud room. So this is just the contrast that I want to just pitch. The Anna Freud consulting room is in a room upstairs. It was never her consulting room, so that's totally different, of course, to Freud. Anna Freud's consulting room was on the second floor of the house, in the other sort of wing of the house. It was never opened to the public. So they took some of her stuff from her consulting room, put it into the room that was Dorothy Burlingham's bedroom. Okay, so already there's a fiction. It's supposed to be the Anna Freud room, but it really isn't the Anna Freud room. And then a couple of years ago, they decided to renovate the Anna Freud room. So they took out her loom, which is really very, very crucial to Anna Freud. She sewed and knitted all of her life. She sewed in her psychoanalytic practice, so she would be sewing as her patient talked. And it was used as a therapeutic, as a work of mourning. So it's quite central. But they said that they wanted to remove the loom to focus on the work. Okay, so that's fair enough. So they renovated the room. So just its contrast, the Sigmund Freud room has never been touched since September 1939, and the Anna Freud room is not her consulting room, and it has been renovated. So it's all about Sigmund Freud. Art. Okay, so that's why I'm here to talk about the art. The Freud Museum London had its first art exhibition in 1989 and has had probably about 85 exhibitions. So I'm just listing. So you can see they're, famous Sophie Calle, Sarah Lucas, Vera Frankel, and also emerging artists, national artists. So it had a very interesting, eclectic, ad hoc take on who would show in the museum. It's had multiple directors. Some of the shows are by invitation, and some of the shows have been by artists putting in applications. Okay, so eclectic and very, very interesting for its eclecticness, really. Okay, Sigmund Freud Museum Vienna is totally different kettle of fish. It's had a director for about 30 years. She's just retired recently. It was founded in 1971. It was basically an empty place. And they decided in 1971 to do a most extraordinary thing, I think, in putting together this museum. They had a plan to make a replica of the couch and just have the couch. And then they decided that they weren't going to do that. And they used a very anthropological and ethnographic kind of display. So they have their empty rooms. with the exception of the waiting room, because Anna Freud gave them some stuff from Mansfield Gardens to put in the waiting room, but for the main rooms, the consulting room and the study are empty. They're empty spaces. What they do have is this kind of screen-like display. And they used photographs by somebody called Edwin Engelmann, who in 1938 went to Burgasa and photographed everything for a museum dedicated to Freud in the future. So they were already kind of thinking in that way. So they used his photographs to basically recreate the space, but the space in itself is empty. And the researcher, the head of research there, who passed away a few years ago, but she went to a conference on museums, and they basically said to her, "This is not a museum. I'm sorry, the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna is just not a museum." The woman who was heading the seminar said, "Well, you know, it's doing this, that, and the other. It's dealing with trauma. It's looking at different..." And no, the other curators and the other directors of museums just wouldn't have it. So lots of people have this response to the Freud Museum in Vienna. Lacan went there, was totally disappointed. The psychoanalytic historian John Forrester went there, and you know, people are just disappointed. They want to go and see the couch, but the couch isn't there. The couch is in London, and the head of research was saying that they've had people come in. Of course, it was. I came here 2 years ago. The couch was here. And it's like, no, the couch is not. You know, so there's this fantasy and this projection that we have onto the Freud Museum in Vienna. So I think of the Freud Museum as a conceptual museum, that it's empty, but it's totally full. It's totally full of history. It's totally full of memory. It's totally full of trauma. So that's kind of interesting. Not embodied in its objects, which are no longer there, which are in London, but embodied in the space itself, the affect of the space. Okay, and their relationship to contemporary art, totally different. So the Inga Schultz-Strasser was the director for about 30 years. She retired a few years ago. And in 1989, she decided to have a contemporary art exhibition there. They invited Joseph Kosuth, and she worked with Pakash, who is a gallerist in Vienna, and they invited Kosuth. So already, right, they're inviting Kosuth, which means something, right? And Kosuth decided that he was going to ask all of his friends to donate a work to the museum. And then about 5 years later, there was another set of donations. They have about 16 works of high conceptual art. It's a conceptual museum interested only in conceptual art. So very, very different, very controlled setting, very specific way of thinking about the museum, and very specific way of thinking about artistic intervention into the space. In 2012, I was fortunate to be able to curate a show at the Freud Museum. The show was called Saying It, and it included the work of Mika Bell, Michelle Williams, Gamaker, and Renat Farrow. And it was about psychoanalytic practice and looking at the consulting room and thinking about the practice of filmmaking and artistic practice in relation to psychoanalytic practice. I think that's all I need to say about it, because that isn't necessarily the point I want to be making. So I have these 80 exhibitions at the Freud Museum London. I have a contemporary art collection at the Freud Museum in Vienna. The Freud Museum Vienna has also had 9 interventions. Again, international artists leaning towards conceptual practice. And I needed to think about what it means to have contemporary art inside an historical museum, in this particular case, inside a personality museum. And the kind of obvious place to go is to site-specific, because in some ways the work is site-specific, but in other ways it just isn't site-specific. So the work is generally not permanent, so it's not there permanently. Even the collection at the Freud Museum Vienna is shown on rotation, and for a while it wasn't even shown, it was just in storage. So the work is not permanent. The work is not constituted by the site in which it is made. So in that way it's very, very different from site-specific. Sometimes the work has institutional critique as a part of it, or discursive critique, or those kinds of things, but not always. Mainly, what has happened is that work that has been made generally for the white cube, at some point in its life, is shown in these spaces. So that's very, very different. So I came up with the idea of site responsivity to think about the way in which having contemporary art in such a space creates a dialogue between the space and the artwork. So to put, for instance, I'm going to use your work, Ram, in the medical museum, it works and it has resonances with that. But that work could just as easily be shown in a different kind of historical museum or in a white cube, and it would have other meaning attached to it. So it's a work that can travel. So I'm interested, or I'm faced with that kind of practice, and I think of it as site responsive, so that the space has an impact on the work and produces different kinds of meanings for the work, and the artwork opens up different ways of thinking about the museum. In my case, because I'm looking at the Freud Museum, different ways of thinking about Freud's life, Freud's work, psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic practice, trauma, all sorts of things, and post-Freudian thought. Okay, so I came up with this idea of site responsivity. A critical intimacy is developed between the site, a temporary critical intimacy, the site and the work of art. Okay, and this is I'm showing you my contents page just to give you a sense of the project. I didn't want to do a chronology, I wanted to do a thematic book. I thought that would be more interesting. And as I was looking at the exhibitions, certain themes emerged and they became the chapters. So the first one is called Staging Psychoanalysis, a hagiographic museum in London. It's all about the consulting room. So it goes back to bourgeois, and it's interested in looking at the way in which museums stage the consulting room, the way in which Freud organized the consulting room, and the impact of that for different artistic practices that are interested in that, and also psychoanalysis today. So, the setup, the couch, and the chair that Freud set up in 1896 is what Schrink's offices look like to this day. Okay, chapter 2 is the archaeological impulse of covering a museum within a museum, and that's looking at archaeology and the different ways in which Freud's interest in antiquities has been activated by different exhibitions. So looking at the metaphor, the archaeological metaphor within psychoanalysis, the materialization and manifestation of archaeology through his antiquities, and his use, the ontology of these objects. He used them in interesting ways when he was writing, when he was thinking, and when he was talking to patients. Okay, chapter 3 on dreaming and traveling through the unconscious. There were a set of exhibitions that were looking at dreams, and the connection between dreams and travel was produced by these exhibitions, but also is very integral to Freud's understanding of the unconscious. So that was kind of interesting. Chapter 4 is approaching trauma, working towards the politics and ethics of art making. Quite a few exhibitions that have been held at the Freud Museum are interested in trauma, from the Holocaust to South African apartheid. So there's quite an expansive take on trauma. And in the end, I've focused this chapter on artists that were interested in the Holocaust. And it's looking at the way in which, when these practices go into the Freud Museum, they open up very particular understandings of the way in which the artists make the work. So the working of the artists in a psychoanalytic way. So it's, my particular take on the show within the Freud Museum would be quite different to somebody else's reading of that same show in a white cube. And that's because the site is having this impact on the way in which we look at the work. Chapter 5, Autobiographical Fictions, Intimate Encounters with Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, and Melanie Klein. That's looking at works, art exhibitions that are that use the autobiographical as a fiction within them. So Sophie Calle, Alice Anderson, Sarah Lucas, and Louise Bourgeois are in that chapter, and I'm going to be presenting the Louise Bourgeois in a couple of minutes. And once you have this kind of autobiographical work within the Freud Museum, it is as though the fiction is that those artists are in analysis. So they're seeing their shrink. Okay, so that's the fiction of that chapter. And chapter 6 is on the Freud Museum in Vienna, and it's very much dedicated to thinking about that as a conceptual museum. Okay. Am I really going over time? I'm trying to.
Not yet.
I'm okay? Okay.
A little bit naughty, but not too.
Sorry. I misprepared, although I did cut things last night. I thought it was 40 minutes. Okay, sorry. Okay. Being with Freud. Sometime in November 1937, a rather extraordinary photograph was taken of a writer and practicing psychoanalyst, Princess Marie Bonaparte, filming her friend and analyst Sigmund Freud. From entries in Freud's diary, we know that during this winter, Marie Bonaparte visited Freud for her ongoing psychoanalysis. She arrived at Bergasse 19 with her daughter, Eugene, who was about to commence her own psychoanalytic treatment with Freud. The photograph shows Freud sitting behind his desk, turning away from us and facing his patient and friend. Bonaparte is crouching down, looking through an early movie camera that she had recently purchased. We don't know if she is filming Freud or is posing for the photograph. Is Freud being filmed or posing by turning to look at Bonaparte? The photograph was taken by Bonaparte's daughter. A piece of autobiographical documentation, the photograph also has elements of being constructed and thus being a fiction. What fascinates me about this image is what I am granted the right to see. The apparatus for looking, the movie camera, the operator of the camera, Bonaparte, and the object of her gaze, Freud. And also, we are in Eugene's position looking at this staging. This mise-en-scène makes it a compelling representation of representing a photograph of a filmic encounter, specifically an encounter between Bonaparte and Freud. In addition to this rather remarkable portrait of looking and representing, there is an intensity figured between the filmmaker and the sitter as each holds the gaze of the other. For me, this photograph is less a portrait of Freud or of Bonaparte filming Freud, although this is rather marvelous and quite unusual, and more a documentation of Marie Bonaparte's engagement with Freud. It strikes me as an image that tells us a great deal about Bonaparte's response to being with Freud, perhaps even a response to a cherished, intimate encounter with Freud. The focal point of this photograph, unlike most portraits of Freud, is not the elder psychoanalyst, but his analysand, Bonaparte. More specifically, the focus of the image is the relationship between the analysand and analyst.
Sorry, Joe. For those of you in the room,
I'm going
English
too fast.
is a second, third, sometimes even fourth language. So let's just go over time a little bit rather than
lose everybody. I'm really
yourself.
sorry. Okay.
It's okay. Is that okay with everybody?
Is that okay? Too fast.
Sorry for
No,
interrupting you.
good that you told me. Okay. Because it concentrates on figuring the relationship between the analyst and analysand as a piece of documentation and a complex piece of autobiographical construction, I consider it an autobiographical fiction. It is part documentation and part fiction. It conveys Bonaparte's desire to be in the world of her analyst. The image stages and represents subjectivity, and in doing so, fictionalizes it. In this instance, the autobiographical fiction could also be read as a moment of analytic transference, a positive transference, wherein a patient's unconscious desire for her analyst has risen to the surface and is captured in this representation. So in a sense, the passion or the love that Bonaparte feels for her analyst, which is what transference, positive transference, is about. Bonaparte has been photographed inside the psychoanalytic stage. One of the Freud Museum London's most pressing provocations is to do what has been captured in this photograph, to encourage its artists and visitors to enter the psychoanalytic stage, to walk into the museum and somehow at the same time walk into Sigmund and Anna Freud's consulting room. This is certainly part of the museum's hagiographic power, its ability to make us believe we are in an active, living consulting room in which the psychoanalyst has momentarily stepped out of. As we wander through the rooms, we wait for the analyst to return. A group of exhibitions carry this fiction forward for us because the artworks rely on fragments and traces of the artist's own life, anecdotes, stories, memories, and objects that once inside the Freud Museum respond to the psychoanalytic context of the site to create a fictional narrative of the artist in analysis. We, like the viewer of the photograph, are invited to look in on this analytic situation. In this talk, I will consider one intervention, the exhibition of Louise Bourgeois' work entitled Return of the Repressed from 2012. This exhibition included a set of artworks and, importantly, a selection of Bourgeois' extensive writings around her experience of being in psychotherapy. I've chosen this intervention because, unlike most exhibitions that invoke the figure and work of Sigmund Freud, this one introduces us to the history of psychoanalysis after Freud and the work of Melanie Klein. Okay. In 2004 and 2010, Louise Bourgeois' assistant, Jerry Gorovoy, discovered over 1,000 loose-leaf sheets of writing in Bourgeois' Chelsea home in New York City. These notes, which included both text and images, related to the more than 30 years of psychoanalytic treatment that Bourgeois undertook between 1951 and 1985. Now, this is a dramatic discovery given Bourgeois' long-standing public criticism of psychoanalysis. She really poo-pooed psychoanalysis, but she was seeing a shrink for over 30 years. This is to begin to make sense of this archive and its position within Bourgeois' oeuvre. Art historian and curator Philip Larratt Smith brought together many of these papers along with an extensive array of Bourgeois' artwork for the landmark exhibition, The Return of the Repressed. The exhibition was first shown in very large museums in Argentina and then Brazil, and a small portion of these went to the Freud Museum in London. So this is quite typical, right? So the artwork has been shown elsewhere and in a non-historical museum in a gallery context, and then is in the Freud Museum London. The intervention that took place within the Freud Museum included 79 items, which is really a vast number of artworks and pieces of writing to be exhibited in the rather small and already very full space of 20 Mansfield Gardens. The site-responsive affect of this crowded intervention constituted something rather extraordinary. On the one hand, we were given access to documents and artworks that would transform our collective understanding of Bourgeois' art practice and its psychoanalytic dimensions. On the other hand, the curation of the show, particularly the choice and density of the material, produced an intense love-hate experience of being with the work. Confined and held by the Freud Museum's powerful psychoanalytic and domestic setting, the engagement with Bourgeois' intimate and powerful accounts of her feminine subjectivity took on a complex psychoanalytic experience of acting out. That's a psychoanalytic term, which I will explain. In order to unpack this, it is helpful to focus on Bourgeois' psychoanalytic writings that dominated the exhibition's affect. By having these personal writings framed and displayed, they turn into a form of art. The writings speak to the many sides of someone we know as Louise Bourgeois. In one of these documents, we read Bourgeois' witty, fulsome, and powerful assessment of her psychoanalysis. The analysis is a jib, is a trap, is a job, is a privilege, is a luxury, is a duty towards myself, my husband, my parents, my children, is a shame, is a farce, is a love affair, is a rendezvous, is a cat and mouse game, is a boat to drive, is an internment, is a joke, makes me powerless, makes me into a cop, is a bad dream, is my interest, is my field of study, is more than I can manage, makes me furious, is a bore, is a nuisance, is a pain in the neck. So, typical, really good assessment of what happens. Okay. In another piece of her psychoanalytic writings, we encounter bourgeois' wants. I want to get, I want to keep, I want to say, I want to tell, I want to see, I want to learn, I want to know, I want to know, I want to control, I want to hold, I want to feel, I want to remember, I want to go, I want to find, I want to finish, I want to get rid of, I want to clean, I want to be good, I want to be better, I want to do it, I want to show, I want to outdo, I want to stop it, I want to accomplish mastery. And the insistent and constant wanting continues for another 4 pages. So I'm just giving you a sense. All 5 pages are handwritten, framed, and hung side by side. Close by, we also encounter her sense of failure. Step number 4, I have failed as a wife, as a woman, as a mother, as a hostess, as an artist, as a businesswoman, and as any 47, as a friend, as a daughter, as a sister. I have not failed as a truth seeker, lowest ebb. And then we read bourgeois' note. When I do not attack, I do not feel myself alive. This form of writing continued unabated throughout the exhibition. We know that Bourgeois was extremely well-read in psychoanalysis. She has references in her writings to Sigmund Freud, Marie Bonaparte, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, to name just a few. Extremely well-read, which she never let on. We also know that Bourgeois first saw her psychoanalyst, Dr. Harry Lowenfeld, after the death of her father in 1951. This loss resulted in a deep depression that lasted over a decade, during which time Bourgeois was unable to make any work. The first 10 years of the artist's psychoanalytic treatment enabled her to come out of the depression and make art once more. At the same time, the therapy confirmed Bourgeois' sense of herself as a psychoanalytic subject, and specifically a Kleinian subject. As psychoanalyst and feminist, Juliette Mitchell argues in her analysis of Bourgeois' psychoanalytic writings as a part of the exhibition catalogue, the artist was able to use her symptoms in a psychoanalytic sense to continue to make her work. Mitchell notices that the writings were filled with an imbrication of various and multiple preoccupations, such as would arise within a clinical session. So Juliette Mitchell is a practicing psychoanalyst and also a feminist. So she was looking at this stuff and thinking, this is actually the kind of things that are said within a psychoanalytic consulting room. And so she focused on Bourgeois' articulation of her violent jealousy in these writings. And Mitchell concludes that if psychoanalysis is a process through which the patient is relieved of their symptoms as a means of being cured, then Bourgeois' treatment cured her of nothing, nor should it have done. She used it to become an important artist. The talismanic precept of psychoanalytic treatment is, where id, the unconscious, is, there ego, conscious shall come to be. For Bourgeois, it was, where id, unconscious, is, there shall a sculpture, unconscious, come to be. So the paradox that Mitchell is highlighting is the way in which Bourgeois worked with the knowledge that making manifest her repressed emotions, such as her jealousy and rage, within her psychoanalysis meant getting better. But if that were to happen, her artwork would suffer, as these repressed emotions fueled the creative process. Thus, bourgeois' conflict was knowing that getting better and becoming a significant artist were in tension. Because of this tension, Mitchell is attuned to the frequent references in bourgeois' writing to the idea of acting out rather than working through. In acting out, bourgeois was able to, that's the second quote, keep the emotions raw and alive, because her sculpture was to make conscious what we all experience unconsciously. She thus has to have more, not fewer, of the symptoms. Both bad and good experiences must be intensified. She goes into what is unbearable, unknowable, which is why it's repressed, and makes it conscious in visual form. Art historian Minyan Nixon takes a different tact to Juliette Mitchell, but I think an important one. Nixon traces the letter L in bourgeois psychoanalytic writings. L for Louise and L for her analyst, Lowenfeld. Tracing this letter and its meaning, Nixon uncovers the ways in which bourgeois' politically and ethically charged artwork and her psychoanalysis function in relation to the complex machinations of the Kleinian subject. Feelings of aggression and violence are followed by anxiety, guilt, fear, and then the need for reparation. And this happens over and over again. This is the case because, as Nixon explains, bourgeois holds herself to account daily, even hourly, in a painstaking catalogue of self-examination, which I've read to you a little bit, duly acknowledging the pleasures of her own beastliness and the pain of its boomerang effects. Unsparing but never self-lacerating, bourgeois recounts the psychic facts of life, the destructive impulses in one's life. Nixon concludes by proposing that bourgeois' relationship to her psychoanalysis is a form of negative transference. So unlike the positive transference of Marie Bonaparte looking passionately at her, or, passionately at Freud, for Klein, negative transference is at the center of analysis. Feelings of violence, aggression, anxiety, and guilt are key. Okay, so spending a long time with this exhibition and with this writing and work meant spending time with, on the one hand, forthright, aggressive, demanding, claustrophobic, and exhausting objects and texts, and on the other hand, being consumed, surprised, delighted, and stimulated by the thought-provoking truth that was being presented. The dichotomy that the show affected opened up the consideration that there may be a correlation between the use to which bourgeois put her psychoanalytic treatment, a use that enabled an acting out, and the way in which the work and show acted out and used the site and the viewer. How so? I'm almost done. Bourgeois was aware of the dilemma she faced as a modern artist, a need for psychological release and an audience to witness that release. She wrote, "The drawing is the most basic psychologique release. The modern artist is caught in a dilemma in that he considers art as a psychological release, at the same time wants to have an audience." Okay, so this kind of connection between the psychology of the Kleinian acting out and the need for an audience and the role of the visitor is brought together in that lovely little piece of writing by Bourgeois. As a viewer, we are members of that audience of whom Bourgeois speaks, and so was the museum. In entering The Return of the Repressed inside the Freud Museum, we move into a condensed version of Bourgeois' already complex world. Layer upon layer of material objects, artworks, words, and memories come together to create an almost claustrophobic space. This is a result of the artwork and the writing itself, as well as the enclosed and restrictive space of the museum. A space that, when filled to the brim with intense work such as Bourgeois, leaves the viewer little room to escape psychologically, emotionally, and literally for a breath of fresh air. They have this very bad habit of not opening their windows at the Freud Museum, London. The site, with its intense psychoanalytic history and memories bearing down on the viewer, as well as the intimacy of the space as a domestic and psychoanalytic one, results in a compressed relationship to bourgeois writing and artwork, and this work gives us no relief. There are so many verbal, visual, and tactile objects, images, and texts in the exhibition, and so much intensity. Artworks are fragmented, broken, missing parts in bits and pieces. The artist's writing is strong, aggressive, overwhelming. Slowly moving through the intervention, looking, reading, listening, seeing, engaging, remembering, sympathizing, because it is very sympathetic, retracting, shaking one's head in astonishment and disbelief, and then in recognition and empathy, a viewer finds herself repositioning her emotions from sympathy and acknowledgement to hostility and anger, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The experience of this show is dramatically conflictual. We are subsumed into bourgeois' world, the dramatic world of a climbing subject. The intensity of encountering this show inside the Freud Museum results in a love-hate encounter with bourgeois art and writing practices. Following Nixon in the writing, we are witnessing a form of negative transference. Following Mitchell, the experience is not one of working through, but acting out. Is it then the case that the love-hate relationship that we experience when encountering the show in the Freud Museum is one that rehearses the acting out of a negative transference? As a complicated form of autobiographical fiction, it is as though the artwork, documents, and exhibition are acting out the complex situation that bourgeois negotiated all of her life, and as a viewer, I was giving it back, loving it and hating it, both at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, if we have plenty of dialogue to find you in the afternoon, but are there any urgent questions before lunch that people want to address to Joanne Morra?
I just wonder this acting out you're talking about here, can you also see it when it comes to other art interventions in cultural historical museums?
Are you talking about other interventions in the Freud Museum?
No, other museums. Or has it just to do with a psychoanalytical sphere? Or,
I don't see why not. I can't think of an exhibition immediately that I've seen that I can say, oh yeah, that had the same kind of impact. I do think that to see this entire show they're huge galleries. The Argentina gallery and the Brazil galleries were enormous. I think it would have you would have a very different experience of it. I think the sense of acting out would be diffuse. I don't think it would be as strong as this, because there are just so many objects in it, so much material in it. And I went to see it a few times, and each time I kind of came away thinking, oh shit, God, I wish you would just stop, just stop this. And at the same time, I was reading it and thinking, oh God, yeah, I know what that feels like. I know what that is. I too have experienced this.
Do you think some of Sarah Lucas's work there perhaps touches on this?
The Sarah Lucas
Sarah
show?
Lucas, I was just thinking in relation to that question, do you think maybe Sarah Lucas' work has
it could.
Kind of cumulative.
Yes.
An overabundance of.
Yes. And also her interest in sexuality and in-your-face sexuality. Yes, I think that's a good example. In this, she had a show at the Freud Museum, and it was a mid-career show that was first shown at Sadie Cole's and then at the Freud Museum. And I look at that in relationship to a first session with Freud, where she was kind of laying out the territory of her practice, because each of the works that were there refer back to earlier works, and so that's how that's the conceit of that.
Anything else? Can I ask one question, Joe, which is, unless I missed it, but you've very purposefully chosen at some point to introduce Kleinian thought amidst the Freudian sort of dynamic. I mean, I live in London, as most people know, in the Hampstead politics around Klein, Freud, sort of even sort of lesser degree to Winnicottian psychoanalytic thought, etc. But it didn't seem declared in the actual presentation here about why you're provoking Klein within the Freudian thought, and I just had curiosity about
that's
whether
a good question. Almost all of the shows are engaging with Freud's ideas, Freud's collection, Freud's antiquities, Freud. And very, very, very few engage with other kinds of other genealogies of psychoanalysis. And bourgeois is one, and I think Klein is inherent in the bourgeois work. And I think that some of the most interesting work that's been done on bourgeois is looking at Klein and bourgeois. And she herself considered herself a Kleinian subject. So I was interested in giving you an example of something that wasn't typical, which may or may not have been a good thing. And then there's only a couple of shows that deal with Anna Freud, and you just think, the directors, their decisions have been made about what kind of exhibitions, but they're literally a handful. And that's kind of interesting as well. Yeah, so my move to other kinds of theories, is based on the work itself and what the work is eliciting. Yeah.
Go on, Frederick, last one.
I'm curious about reading practices, like reading exhibition practices.
Yeah.
And the beautiful way you read this bourgeois work or this bourgeois exhibition made me think about your own thoughts about the methods of reading exhibition and reading this specific exhibition when it comes to notion of identification, or like how could you say something about that, like the reading, the method of reading or looking or like encountering, or how can you hold this acting out in the
Different exhibitions do different kinds of work. And so for instance, in thinking about site responsivity, I've kind of tried to set up a skeleton of the kinds of adjectives that would be site responsive. So I have things like interjection, working through, placement, so these kind of active verbs that exhibitions have used as a part of their curatorial strategy. So you have to remember also that a very few, maybe, 15 exhibitions of 85 have a curator, maybe 20. So all of the rest of them is basically the artist going in, working with the museum director, and so she says, no, you can't put something on the couch, but they're very, they're really easygoing. So yes, lots of people. So the reading of the shows is based on the particularity of the show, and my engagement with the shows differs depending on what the show does. So this one is a very close reading, whereas other ones are I invoke other exhibitions to talk about something to do with psychoanalysis. So, they open up a particular way of thinking about psychoanalysis, or they open up an idea that Freud spent a lot of time talking about. So it gives me an opportunity to look at psychoanalytic practice and psychoanalytic theory. Is that? So it's provoked by the
museum. Like, I wonder how much a Freudian input, like whatever that is, like a Freudian framework or a Freudian input thought, directs your way of reading.
Oh, you can't help but doing that. There's no other way of doing it. That's the whole point of having work in the Freud Museum. It's just like bang, it's psychoanalysis. And some things are successful and some things aren't. But there's no way to escape that. You can't read it outside of that context because that is the context. So it's psychoanalysis all the way, basically.
Thank you, Joanne Morra. Thank you.